Today, let's start with Yuval Harari's Sapiens, Part 3. However, can we really go ahead and judge someone's worth solely based on the size of their bank account? I mean, come on, think about it for a second. Sometimes, circumstances just happen to align, and an individual puts in the hustle to make a buck. It's like the stars decided to shine just right on them, you know. And yeah, sure, it might seem like their triumph is all about the money. That's what the headlines scream at us. But if we're looking for solid proof of that, folklore won't back us up. Life's a bit more complex than a simple tally of dollars. And hey, remember what I was saying earlier? If you get into a chat with followers of Hinduism's caste system about this whole measuring success thing, hold on to your hat, things might get interesting. They might start yapping about how the divine powers crafted a top-tier caste and a lower one that's supposed to be lesser. It's like they believe the universe itself stamps certain folks as VIP and others as just regular old general admission. Now, these ideas are more likely to pop up in places like India, where the whole caste system sprouted its roots. It's been around for ages, evolving like some ancient creature. Back in the day, it might have started with just a few categories, maybe like 4 or 5, you know, the classics. But these days, we're talking about a whopping 2,000 different castes floating around. And hold on to your hat again. Unofficially, it's rumored there's another 1,000 hiding in the shadows. Yep, that's right. There's a whole secret caste society going on. With so many castes, there are even publications that take a shot at ranking them in order of prestige. It's like a caste leaderboard. Who would have thought? You know, in school, we learn about Brahmins, Kshatriyas, and the rest, those names that sound like characters from a fantasy novel. But that's like scratching the surface. In reality, there are thousands like 1,700 or 2,700, and who's higher up the ladder gets kind of blurry. It's like trying to count stars on a starry night. You lose track pretty fast. So they end up comparing, categorizing, and looking down on each other based on these divisions, like it's some kind of ancient caste Olympics, all while donning their competitive attitudes like a badge of honor. Funny thing is, even if there are folks who've snagged top spots in India, they still label themselves. It's like they're wearing these labels like designer clothes, even if they've got a closet full of other achievements. But here's a twist. If you took these high flyers and dropped them in the West, say, Europe or the United States, they'd just blend into the mix as Brahmins or untouchables, more or less just Asians. Yep, that's the funny thing about labels. They're like those "hello, my name is" stickers that you slap on yourself at networking events. Among their own, they've set up walls and hierarchies, not letting anyone from the lower rungs step into their fancy realm, all in the name of protecting their precious privileges. And here's something else to chew on. You can even spot this idea in the world of education. While it's not as common these days, back in the day, a doctoral degree from the US or Europe used to make folks go starry-eyed. It's like they were bringing back this golden ticket from Willy Wonka's chocolate factory. Nowadays, sure, you might get a nod for your efforts, some recognition. But let's face it, compared to back then, a lot of folks with cushy jobs these days actually take home less than those in easier gigs. It's like we're all on this never-ending roller coaster of labels and value judgments, up and down, up and down. And all we want to do is just enjoy the ride without worrying about who's in the seat next to us. You bet a few professors might be dangling those shiny tenure and lifelong job prospects in front of their eager students. But when we get down to the nitty-gritty of cold, hard cash, things get a bit fuzzy. Sure, there's a sprinkle of those cushy government or research positions, and even some corporate gigs that talk a big game about social issues, but they're not exactly swarming the scene like bees to honey. Let's jet over to India for a moment, where the divide between Brahmins and Sudras isn't some cosmic battle of cosmic proportions. It's not like the universe took sides, one being the head and the other the feet. No, this caste division that's been simmering for over 3,000 years in northern India is more like some powerful figure at the time. Cook it up, playing by their own set of rules. Back then, someone with a bit of muscle decided to whip up this caste stew, and those who saw its perks just kept refining it and passing it down the line. It's like a masterclass in brainwashing. And despite what Aristotle might have thought, there's zero scientific evidence to support the idea that being born free or in chains has any say in how moral you turn out. Yeah, that's right, Aristotle's grand tales aren't exactly backed by science. The whole concept of human hierarchy that bird masters and slaves was pretty much thrown together without any real logic to it. It's like someone just mixed a bunch of ingredients and hoped for the best. And let's talk about differences like skin color or hair type between folks. Yeah, biology shows us they're there, but there's zilch proof that these differences dictate someone's moral compass, even though different races have been mingling for centuries. Let's just consider this. Not a single soul, not one single couple, was ever born exclusively into one race. Let's just assume that for a moment. So at best, they might be, what, around 200 pure. But what does pure even mean in this context? It's a bit of a head scratcher. Maybe someone is 100 pure, and the scales might tip a tad one way or the other. Of course, most folks aren't exactly thrilled with these pre-made pecking orders. But here's the kicker: when it comes to their own special hierarchy, they manage to find an exception. It's like humans can't resist these traps, almost like trying to dodge raindrops. Within their own society, their hierarchy seems like the most natural thing in the world. But then they peek at other societies' hierarchies, those they label as ridiculous and absurd, and they use those as the gold standard. And let's dive into the economic side of things, shall we? Plenty of folks with fat wallets got there because they were born into plush families. And on the flip side, plenty of folks on the poverty end stay stuck there their entire lives, all because their family tree wasn't exactly a money tree. That's where it all begins. Sure, there might be cases where super talents turn the tables on their luck. Maybe they inherit a fortune, but end up losing it and finding themselves on the streets. But more often than not, they tend to stick with what's been handed down to them. So let's face it, the birth of social discrimination is seriously knotted up with noticeable differences in skills. It's like a tangled mess that we're still trying to untangle. You know, what's the real deal? Diversity in skills and personalities, often fueled by these made-up scenarios we humans cooked up over the ages. They're like the secret sauce to this whole human experience. Here's the kicker: most talents need a bit of nurturing and some fine-tuning. Sure, that requires a fair share of rich experiences. But the bottom line is this: even if you have a natural knack for something, if you don't give it a solid workout and refine it through practice, it's just going to be sitting there, catching sumses or fading away into oblivion. Isn't it a bit of a downer that not everyone gets an equal shot at developing and honing their skills? I mean, history's been serving up this dish for quite a while, and it's shown us over and over again that where you land on this imaginary societal hierarchy can truly shape your opportunities and your place. Trying to wriggle free from the rulebook society's set in stone. Let's just say, not exactly a leisurely stroll through the park. And you know what? This book is all about it too. Let's step back to the days of British rule over India. Whether it was the struggling masses or the elite Brahmins, even the Irish Catholic bunch, life was no cakewalk for most of them. Even if a genius were to emerge in such an environment, they'd still find themselves lagging behind those born right at the heart of the British Empire. This intricate dance of economics, politics, and culture. It's like a maze crafted from written rules and silent barriers, and breaking free. Well, that's easier said than done. These constructs, they're like puppet strings, pulled and manipulated to keep things in place. And here's a juicy nugget about the whole matter. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the old philosopher, he wasn't exactly throwing a party in religion's honor. But you know what's been happening recently? A whole flood of negativity. But hey, let's remember, those are just personal stories. So, he dives deep into how both religious and scientific narratives get twisted to put people down. And he goes straight for the stories right from the good old Bible. Let's take a little trip back in history. When European conquerors set foot in the United States, they brought along millions of African slaves. These individuals endured unimaginable hardships on sprawling plantations and in mines, treated as if they were worth less than the dirt they walked on. Now, they had a vast pool of potential laborers. So why did they lean so heavily on African slaves? Well, there are a few reasons for that. First off, Africa's right there, conveniently next door. So transporting slaves from various African nations was a whole lot more practical than trying to haul them from East or Southeast Asia. It's all about efficiency, you see. Of course, as time marched on, importing slaves from Africa became a bit trickier. So in the later stages, they tricked people who didn't have much knowledge about North and South America. Nowadays, there aren't too many folks of that sort showing up, escaping the clutches of the societal game we're all roped into. It's like trying to dodge a hailstorm. And guess what? This book's all about that too. Remember when Britain was calling the shots in India? The Dalits and Brahmins, and even the Irish Catholic crowd, were leading lives that could only be described as grueling. Even if a prodigy emerged among them, they'd still be trailing behind those with similar talents, born right in the heart of the British realm. When it comes to the economy, politics, and culture, this game is like a labyrinth of rules and invisible barriers that you just can't seem to break free from. These structures, they are always being manipulated and firmly held in place. But you know what's eerie? How this kind of brainwashing sneaks up on you. At first, when these notions start floating around, they might sound strange or even absurd. But with time, as those few voices become a chorus of tens, hundreds, even thousands, not acknowledging these notions starts feeling odd. And even in the United States, as time passed, African Americans started believing these stereotypes themselves, buying into ideas like being less intelligent, more prone to violence, and intellectually inferior compared to their counterparts. They began viewing themselves as inherently lesser in various aspects. This concoction of myths and pseudoscience, it really sank its teeth in, especially during the era of slavery. And it held on tight, even after many of the factors that led to slavery had faded away. This cycle just wove itself deeper into the fabric of society as time marched on. But across the centuries, these cycles of oppression have persisted, all based on nothing but imagination and coincidences throughout history. And unfortunately, this kind of unjust discrimination isn't exactly the kind of thing that gets better with time. If anything, it can often get worse. We're all familiar with the truth. Well, poverty has a habit of sticking around for those who are already struggling, and education tends to thrive for those who are already educated. Ignorance, yeah, that tends to grow too. You know what's a real kicker? Once someone gets victimized, it's like a chain reaction. Their descendants often end up facing the same fate. And you can bet your bottom dollar that the privileged ones, the historically fortunate, they tend to keep that privilege flowing down the family tree. But you know what's wild? In most scenarios, those in power twist and turn the norms of the time to suit their needs. The idea of leading a self-determined life is brought into the spotlight again. And if all this seems too complex and far removed from your daily grind, just remember this one thing. Throw the idea of acting like a man or acting like a woman out the window. All those behaviors tied to those stereotypes, they're just stories made up by someone way back when. Sure, on a general scale, men might have a slight physical edge over women. But guess what? When you zoom in on individuals, there are plenty of female athletes who could put most guys to shame. With the right training, some women could outperform men in combat skills or athletic prowess. So it really boils down to the individual, and it's high time we toss those handed-down stereotypes into the dustbin of history. And here's the twist. Even though we might be witnessing big changes unfold, the ideology lurking within this worldview, man, it's a tough nut to crack. The stuff tied to this ideology, the modern concepts, 21st century ideals, all the latest trends, they're all the rage. But in some sneaky ways, the subtle forms these ideas take now are even more slippery than before. You'll hear claims like, ideology is old news. The 21st century is moving beyond ideology, especially from various social systems, often the more conservative ones. Remember those highfalutin arguments about ideology baiting the dust? Well, guess what's hidden beneath that veil of no ideology? It's the notion that there's no such thing as a complete absence of ideology, and that's something worth keeping in mind. So that's the core of it. Back in the day, the focus was often on politics, like it was all about dominating the political scene. But these days, it's seeping into every nook and cranny of daily life, from work to hobbies, what you consume, drink, even the cultural preferences you have. In today's world, the traits of ideologies spread through advertisements, marketing ploys, and promotions of all sorts, bombarding people without them even realizing it. Take workers, for instance. Many of them don't even stop to think about how they might be getting the short end of the stick. Folks think they're the ones holding the power in a democracy. Consumers, too, often fall for the trick that most companies are really working for their benefit. Sure, there might be instances where companies face boycotts or backlash from the public, or even where political or business giants crumble under public pressure. But more often than not, they just keep on trucking, quietly enjoying the perks they're entitled to. The new political players, the strength of citizens, grassroots revolutions. These concepts are often co-opted and twisted as part of the manipulation. Just like this book I recently got my hands on, diving deep into the political arena. It's all about David Cameron, the ex-head of the Conservative Party in the UK, a quintessential Oxford elite from a well-off family. But here's the kicker: during the 2009 election, he was all about giving power to the people, letting citizens reclaim their influence. He played the game of dialogue with all sorts of characters: factory workers, pub owners, bartenders, farmers, you name it. And guess what? It worked like a charm, winning him heaps of public support. But you know what's the twist? Once he was in power, he turned a total 180-degree. He tripled university tuition fees, waving around the banner of fiscal responsibility. He weakened the National Health Service, a symbol of the IUC's social safety net. He sliced away funds, and when students rose up against the tuition hikes, they were met with brute force. These images were plastered all over, painting him and his administration as a force to be reckoned with. But behind the scenes, they silenced students and quashed protests. So after breezing through the elections with a superficial ideology, the reality was quite the opposite. Most of the folks in David Cameron's circle were millionaires with pedigrees from private schools. His election campaign downplayed his background and emphasized where he could take the nation. Once he cleared the election hurdle with that shiny ideology on the surface, his true colors started shining through. And guess what? These types of scenarios are playing out in Korea too. Business tactics are getting slicker by the day. Guerrilla marketing, word of mouth, online buzz, participatory marketing, all those social media tricks, they make consumers feel like the kings and queens of the castle. It's all smoke and mirrors, and then these companies shamelessly push their products. Business strategies are becoming more intricate, and people are becoming more adept at spotting the tricks. They talk a big game, saying things like, "The public understands the world better than anyone." But let's get real for a moment. That's not exactly the case. Sure, folks have more information at their fingertips compared to the past, but most of it's taken in superficially or in quick swipes on the internet, hardly diving deep. A lot of articles these days are practically indistinguishable from gossip pieces. And those articles that really matter, the ones that require a bit of effort to read, they seem to be slipping further and further away from our grasp. And hey, don't even get me started on how these issues rear their heads in the realm of the environment. Oil companies, for instance, often present themselves as the saviors of the planet, championing alternative energy solutions. Oh boy, here's the scoop. Those big shots are playing some sneaky games when it comes to alternative energy. They're all about supporting those eco-friendly companies on the surface. But deep down, they're buying stakes that let them steer the ship while still holding onto their old school petroleum interests. They're pulling the strings, my friend. Now, let's dive into the wild world of everyday products. Check out Coca-Cola, a brand that practically everyone on the planet knows about. They rolled out this huge environmental campaign a while back, bragging about their eco-friendly plant bottle packaging. They were shouting from the rooftops about how they were gonna churn out over 2 billion plant bottles every year, like they were Earth's heroes or something. But here's the kicker, as cool as that sounds, it's just a drop in the bucket when you realize that Coca-Cola actually sells around 10 billion bottles annually. That's like, what, a tenth of the total? It's all smoke and mirrors, my friend. And that's the thing, it makes you think in all sorts of directions. We've got to dig deeper, look beyond the surface to see the real deal. Alright, let's shift gears and talk about the messy tango between violence and hierarchy in the grand pyramid of society. Back in the day, like a few centuries ago, hierarchies were all the rage. In Europe, you had your Europeans, then the Indians, with the lower castes, and way down at the bottom, the outcasts and pariahs, lower even than the lowest caste. And even within the European category, there were divisions between European men and European women. It was like a social ladder straight out of a history book. And let me tell you, the lower you were, the more you suffered. Just take Aung San Suu Kyi from Myanmar, for instance. She got a first-hand taste of that discrimination and oppression. But today, when you think of Myanmar, the first thing that pops up is usually oppression and violence. And while history might have had moments where minority groups oppressed the folks in Myanmar, continuing that cycle of pain is just plain wrong. Suppressing and hurting others, that's bound to hit a dead end when those same people start taking charge of their own lives. Now, let me hit you with another fascinating story. It's all about the Netherlands and Indonesia, two countries with a history so complex it could make your head spin. Back in World War II, the Netherlands got caught up in Nazi Germany's invasion spree, and it was a real mess. The fate of the Queen was up in the air, adding a dash of drama to the whole situation. So the Netherlands kind of danced the tango with Germany. Not too close, not too far. And they were pretty chill with foreign press. But honestly, it didn't change the game all that much. When it all boiled down, it didn't really shift the narrative too much. But wait, let's turn our attention to Indonesia's connection with the Netherlands. Now that's where things get real interesting. The Netherlands and Indonesia, oh boy, their history is like a labyrinth. The Dutch East India Company was like a big deal, strutting around with serious swagger. When the dust from World War II settled, they acted like they were holding back. But surprise, they grabbed assets and claimed territories of other countries, all the while saying those places had been theirs all along. Here's the twist: the Netherlands had their fair share of suffering under Nazi Germany's rule during World War II. But once the war ended, they suddenly became best friends forever with Indonesia. Now, historically speaking, Indonesia had its own power game going on, especially thanks to the Dutch East India Company. The road to Indonesia's independence is a bumpy one, my friend. Japan stepped into the picture during World War II, occupying the country. After the war, there was this vibe for Asians to unite and shape their own destinies. Post-World War II, a bunch of countries, including the good old USA, threw their weight behind Indonesia's quest for independence. And that put the heat on the Netherlands to cough up some economic aid. This was the foundation for Indonesia's revolutionary movement, with hundreds of thousands of Indonesians standing up against the Dutch. The Indonesian War of Independence was no joke. It lasted about 5 long years, from late 1945 to 1949. During this struggle, around 100,000 fighters and countless civilians are thought to have lost their lives. And here's where Java and Sumatra Islands come into play. These babies are big shots, with over 7 million Indonesians going about their business on these islands, shaping the country's economic landscape. Here's the kicker: Japan actually played a significant role, and it's pretty darn interesting. From Indonesia's perspective, they lucked out in a weird way. Why? Because Japan's downfall turned out to be a blessing. Originally, the plan was to cozy up and collaborate, with Japan lending a hand. Since the Netherlands had quite the grip on the region, Indonesia's initial goal was to play nice and maybe merge later down the line. But when Japan hit rock bottom, that plan evaporated into thin air. And that's where Japan, unintentionally, came to Indonesia's rescue as their troops pulled out. When the Declaration of Independence rang out, the British Allied forces swooped in to keep things in check. They set up shop in Jakarta, and while Indonesia might have managed some semblance of public order on their own, given the vast number of islands, it was a whole different ballgame. Internal conflicts and tribal rivalries were like a wild roller coaster. Fast forward a bit, and the British forces struggled to keep the peace because, well, their numbers were limited. Before the Dutch military came onto the scene, they even reached out to Japanese troops for help. But Japan, weakened and beaten, wasn't exactly in a position to lend a helping hand to other nations. They did manage to offer some limited support to Indonesia, supplying weapons to the fighters. The British were trying to steady the ship, but Indonesia's complexities made it a tall order. With the end of World War II, the Netherlands, having taken quite a beating under Nazi Germany's rule, found themselves in quite the pickle. They launched a foreign military expedition to recapture Indonesia's territories, and this left the Netherlands pretty much defenseless back home. But here's the twist: thanks to the ongoing Cold War and the influence of the Soviet Union, Europe was dealing with its own mess, making it tough to focus on matters abroad. So, even though the Netherlands was trying their darndest, they eventually threw in the towel. The British forces stepped aside, making room for the Netherlands to make their move in Indonesia. The Netherlands was between a rock and a hard place. They had endured years of Nazi Germany's rule, and now they were dealing with a postal muddle. But they still had their sights set on regaining control over their prize colony. So they marshaled around 160,000 troops to storm into Indonesia. This is where the United States swooped in to save the day. The US had Indonesia's back, backing their fight for independence and giving the whole movement a legitimacy boost. Seeing that the situation wasn't looking too rosy and realizing that Indonesia wasn't exactly a piece of cake to subdue, the Netherlands had no choice but to bow to Indonesia's call for independence. The US even hinted that they'd pull the financial plug and mess with NATO's support if the Netherlands put up a fight. This diplomatic nudge left the Netherlands with few options, especially considering their heavy reliance on US financial aid via the Marshall Plan. The incentive to play nice was ramped up even more when they joined NATO. So the Netherlands had to come to grips with the fact that they couldn't keep Indonesia under their thumb any longer. With a bit of reluctance, they had to accept Indonesia's bid for freedom. And that's where the US comes in, a real game changer in the whole process. They backed Indonesia's fight for independence and turned the heat up on the Netherlands to get with the program. The Netherlands, weakened by World War I's aftermath, simply couldn't defy the US's demands. And so, despite their colonial history and their aspirations to hold onto Indonesia, the Netherlands had to loosen their grip. It was a pivotal moment in Indonesia's story. In today's crazy geopolitical landscape, it's pretty darn clear that the Netherlands were in over their heads trying to cling to Indonesia. The US had the upper hand, and their influence and pressure played a massive role in shaping how Indonesia's battle for independence played out. But here's the thing that's a bit mind-blowing. There were folks back then who were super against getting their hands on weapons. And that, my friend, is a history lesson for the ages. If you want to prevent war, you better be ready for it. That's a thread that runs throughout the book, Sapiens.